I'd like to begin by giving you a little bit of background to the story that I just read to you by C.S. Lewis. It was originally published in 1977 under the title The Man Born Blind. Now, this was a number of years after C.S. Lewis had died, but actually a friend of Lewis's said that it was likely written in the early 1920s, which would put it as one of the earliest pieces of writing that C.S. Lewis had done, at least one of the earliest short stories that he'd ever written. But then something fascinating happened. 2 decades after C.S. Lewis had died, in the mid-1980s, a new manuscript appeared out of nowhere. It lands in a London bookseller, and it's called Light. And this manuscript, Light, is a revised version of The Man Born Blind. So this manuscript is passed around a few people, and then the C.S. Lewis scholars get their hands on it. And for a while it was debated whether this was a story of Lewis's or whether it was a forgery. But broadly speaking, it's agreed this actually was a revised version of the story by C.S. Lewis that was done much later. So some people call it the last short story of C.S. Lewis. So we have this interesting dichotomy, which is connected to the story itself, between this being the first short story that C.S. Lewis ever wrote and the last short story that C.S. Lewis ever wrote. And the one that I read to you is the Revised Manuscript. Now, what's interesting about the story is it captures something that's central to the work of C.S. Lewis right from the 1920s until he died. And it's something that can be articulated in his writings about the difference between enjoyment and contemplation. So in his book, Surprised by Joy, he talks about how he read this book by the philosopher Samuel Alexander in 1924. It's a book called Space, Time and Deity. He read this book, and in the book, he saw this distinction between enjoyment and contemplation. And he said that he immediately understood the importance of these concepts. And he took these concepts and he made them his own. He changed them a little bit from the original. And basically, enjoyment is the name he gives to the experience of something. So when you hear the word enjoyment in relation to this distinction, it's not about something pleasurable necessarily. It's just something that you're feeling. It can be painful. You enjoy love, but love can bring suffering. You enjoy the experience of eating, but this notion of enjoyment even expands out to eating something that you dislike terribly. Even to be tortured or to break your arm is a form of enjoyment in the sense that C.S. Lewis means it, the technical sense of a bodily existential experience. And then there's contemplation. And contemplation is where you're able to think about and reflect on something. So you might write about love, or you might experience love. So you might contemplate love, you might enjoy love. And one of the things that C.S. Lewis explored is how never the twain shall meet. These are two incommensurable worlds. The more you're in enjoyment, the less you're in contemplation, and vice versa. And you can contemplate something that you're enjoying, but it's not exactly the same. When you're contemplating it, you're stepping outside of it. You're looking at it from a distance. You're reflecting on it. And when you're in it, you can't do that because you're immersed within it. You're immanent to it. You're saturated by the phenomenon. So enjoyment and contemplation. This causes a problem because we would like to be able to bring the two of these together. And for C.S. Lewis, the answer to this was in myth. Myth is a type of writing that isn't quite fiction and it isn't quite non-fiction. It's something else. It's a type of writing that allows you to experience something while also satisfying some intellectual dimension of yourself. The mind and the soul have some sort of satisfaction or nourishment in a good myth. So in this story, we see 3 characters. There's Anne, there's Robin, and there's the painter. Now, this is an allegory. So think of light as a type of metaphysical substance The light is a representation of truth, of the absolute, of beauty, of the ethical foundations of the world, of basically the ground of being, God. Right? That's what the light is. And you have on one hand Anne, who could be seen as a type of scientific thinker, a type of thinker who just sees the world as it is, and who doesn't understand why Robin is trying to seek light. She doesn't even understand what the question is. In one way, she's in pure enjoyment. She's in enjoyment in the sense that she's immersed in the world, she's interacting with the world, but there's no dimension of this world that is strange to her, that is uncanny, that causes her to reflect on its ground. And then on the other side, you have this wild painter. And the painter can be seen as a representation of someone who's superstitious. On one side, you've got the scientific, kind of looking at the world as just, it is what it is. There is no grounding force. That question doesn't even kind of make sense. You're simply in the world. It's the world of the ordinary. And then the painter is in the world of the occult. Right? And by the way, C.S. Lewis is probably thinking about his friend Owen Barfield when he's writing this, because Barfield was an anthroposophist, a type of occultist who believed in being able to kind of see behind the veil of illusion and see ultimate reality. And that's what the painter is. The painter is the one who's saying, I know the truth. I know what beauty is. I know what the absolute is. Right? So you've got these two characters, and then you have Robin. Now, Robin is dissatisfied. Robin is a searcher. Robin has the sense that there is something called light. There is some sort of truth. There is beauty. There is an ultimate ground. And he's looking for it everywhere. And the first relationship that you have in the story is between Anne and Robin. And Anne cannot understand this search. She is, as I say, in pure enjoyment, in the sense of just pure immersion in the world. But Robin feels in the world, but not of it. Robin feels an uncanny relationship to the world and is looking for something that is kind of deeper than what can be seen, something that grounds what is perceivable. And his relationship with Anne just makes him all the more dissatisfied, all the more frustrated. And he's looking, in fact, symbolically, he goes on this walk, which means he goes on this searching journey to find light. And he starts to think that maybe it doesn't exist, or it exists in some faraway country, and only a few people have ever seen it. And then he comes across the painter. Now, in many ways, of course, Anne and the painter are paradigmatic opposites. But the frustration of his relationship with Anne is pushing him all the more towards what will happen when he meets the painter. Because when he meets the painter, he meets someone who is a type of preacher of the truth, who says, I know what the absolute is. I know what light looks like. I can give it to you. I can present it on this canvas for you. Now, in truth, the painter could be just speaking with hyperbole. But Robin takes this very seriously. And Robin then walks into the light in order to drink it in order to swoon within it. And as a result, he walks off the side of the quarry, falls to his death. Now, this is interesting because you wouldn't expect this from Lewis. The idea that actually the worst of the two positions is the person who thinks they know the truth. They are the more dangerous one. This is a type of psychological or psychotic certainty, right? The person who is tyrannized by the truth. And this searcher who then finds this community or finds this individual who says they have the truth doesn't lead to life, but leads to a type of death. And that's the pure contemplation, right? Because for C.S. Lewis, the deepest truth is not a truth that can be grasped as an object of contemplation. If you do that, you will end up with nothing. You won't end up with something, you'll end up with vapor in your hands, and you'll end up in a type of psychic death. But C.S. Lewis also is critiquing Anne and the idea that we can just be in the world and not ask these deeper questions, not be searchers, not look for some sort of deeper truth than the one that we merely kind of see in our everyday lives. So to understand how we can kind of bring these two together, I want to turn to the work of Paul Tillich. Now, what's important here when you read this story is to realize that really what Robin wants to do is get rid of anxiety. He wants to get rid of his dissatisfaction. He would love to be like Anne. And I think it's hinted at even in the story. He'd love to be able to shut off this question and just live in the world. And then ultimately he's drawn and seduced by the one who can get rid of the anxiety and dissatisfaction by giving the answer. So this entire story is about Robin trying to overcome this anxiety of not knowing what the truth is, not knowing where he fits within this, not being able to shut the question down, and ultimately falling for someone who says they can give the answer. Now, the story doesn't end with how Robin really should have done things. But if we look at the work of Paul Tillich, we might get a hint of what C.S. Lewis is trying to explore here. In 1967, a book called My Search for Absolutes was published. It was Paul Tillich's last book. It was a series of lectures he gave in Chicago, and it was published posthumously. And in this book, he talks about his search for absolutes, his search for the truth. Just like Robin in the story, it's a story where he's telling these students of his philosophical endeavor to grasp the metaphysical reality. And it's a beautiful book. I would really recommend you read it. It's a very short book, and it's got these really interesting illustrations from a very famous American cartoonist at the time. In this book, basically Tillich argues that the search for truth is the evidence of having found the truth. So he talks about in philosophy, for example, whenever you argue about truth, if you argue whether truth exists or not, right, you find someone who says they don't believe in truth, and maybe you start arguing because you do believe in truth, and the two of you have this argument. Tillich would say that both of you are presupposing truth. You don't argue to truth, you argue from it. As soon as you engage in the argument, you are both presupposing something deeper because you're agreeing that there's a way to solve this. You're agreeing that you can understand each other, that you can move towards an answer. And so although you can have a theory of truth, even to have a theory of truth is already to be immersed within the truth. And then he uses the example of beauty. He talks about how an artist will want to capture the very essence of the beautiful. And every time they try to do it, well, they fail, they miss in some sort of way. And so artists will often go back to the same painting, the same landscape, just like Monet, who painted around 250 different canvases of the same pond. But it's not simply that they cannot grasp beauty. They're already grasped by beauty. The very pursuit is the evidence that beauty is there. So although they're always failing to grasp it, that failure is something that is satisfying, that is productive. Just like for the philosopher, the pursuit of truth is actually what generates satisfaction and brings productivity. And finally, as well, he uses the example of someone who's in law, who's trying to articulate justice. And again, he says that every time you try to articulate what justice is, you miss it. You write down laws, and laws can be just, but they're never completely just. That's why you can always rechange them and adapt them to new situations, because the law never fully captures justice. But the very pursuit of justice shows that that person is already standing within it. So the idea is that the dissatisfaction of not having is the satisfaction of having. This is actually captured in the verse in Matthew 7:7 that says, "Ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened." The actual literal translation is slightly different from the way we hear it. So when we read this verse, it seems like there's a time delay right? Ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. So for example, if I lose something and I look for it, eventually I'll find it. And there's a time gap where if I knock on the door, I have to wait and then the door is opened. But in the original, it would be better to say, ask is receiving, seeking is finding, knocking is the door opening, right? It's not cause and effect. It's more dialectic, like heat and light. They are happening together. This actually connects with something in the work of Albert Camus. Camus talked about the conservative and the revolutionary. And he talked about the conservative as someone who looks back to maybe a golden age in the past and who works towards returning to that golden age. And they're dissatisfied by their work, by having to do that. But they fantasize that if they finally got to that point, then they would be happy. In contrast, you have the revolutionary, and the revolutionary looks forward to a utopia. And they're dissatisfied until they get to that utopic end. And they fantasize that if they could get there, everything would be wonderful. And part of the problem, of course, is one, you're dissatisfied because you haven't got to your golden age or your utopia. And then secondly, if you ever do create that golden age or that utopia, it's not going to be what you expect, right? That's always disappointment at the point that you get it. And so Camus brings up a third character, and it's the character of the rebel. And the rebel is someone who enjoys their dissatisfaction, who has an idea of a better world, but they enjoy the struggle for it. In the very fight for that, they find meaning and truth and beauty and a moral way of being. The perfect example of the rebel is Marlon Brando in the movie On the Waterfront, where he's part of a gang called the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. And he's playing a character called Johnny who's in this cafe. And this woman says to Johnny, what are you rebelling against? And Johnny just looks at her and he's tapping on this table and he says, what do you got? Right? You've got this image of that rebel who's enjoying the very act of struggle itself. And this is a way of thinking about the kingdom of God, that it's not in front of you, it's not behind you, it's within you, in the very act of love, in the very work of bringing the kingdom of God into the world. The kingdom of God is in the world. The act of working towards it is the evidence of its being. The mystics would say that the act of trying to grasp the truth shows that you're grasped by the truth. The very attempt to name the truth shows that you are already named by the truth. Now for Tillich, there's a problem on either side of this. We have the tendency to either go towards a one-dimensional empty type of life, like the life of Anne in the story, where we don't feel the uncanniness of the world, we don't feel this sense of beauty and of ethics and of truth that cannot be grasped but is always grasping us, that is always moving us, right? So we lose all sense of that, we close it down. Now it's always there as a whisper, but we basically shut ourselves off from it as much as we can and just move on with our everyday lives, right? And that's what Tillich talks about as a type of emptiness. Or he talks about the demonic. And the demonic is where you experience this feeling of beauty, of ethics, and of truth, but you create a type of discourse in a community that thinks that you have it, that you can name it, that you can put it in a bottle. And this is demonic because it leads to this sense of what's called in theology idolatry, where you think you have the truth. And when you think you have the truth, then you can use that as a weapon to destroy everybody else. And for Tillich, interestingly, like Lewis, there is this certain sense in which the life of faith is about keeping that space open. That the language of faith is a language of having and not having, of struggle and searching that is simultaneously finding and being. That there is a certain dissatisfaction that is itself also satisfaction. And actually, C.S. Lewis called this joy. Joy is a type of pleasure that we get from not having. It's a type of enjoyment in the struggle of life itself. And there's something about having a desert in the oasis of our lives, a place where we can go that can help us experience this sense of being immersed in a truth and a beauty and an ethics that we cannot grasp. There's something about that we need today, we need yesterday, and we need tomorrow. And there's something about this that both Tillich and Lewis would call the life of faith.